The Japanese destroyer's searchlight swept across the black water like the finger of death itself, and I knew that in 3 seconds we would either be heroes or fish food. Lieutenant gripped the wheel of PT-109 so tight his knuckles had gone white in the moonlight, while behind us, 4 Mark I torpedoes sat ready in their tubes, each one carrying enough explosive punch to send a transport ship straight to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. It was October 15, 1942, and we were about to prove that sometimes the smallest boats can make the biggest waves. I've been riding these plywood coffins to the Solomon Islands for 6 months now. When I first volunteered for PT boat duty back in New London, Connecticut, I thought I was signing up for adventure. What I got was something far more dangerous and far more important than I could have ever imagined. The Elko PT-109 bucked beneath my boots as we cut through the choppy waters of Blackett Strait at 30 knots. She was 77 feet of pure American engineering, mahogany planking over oak frames, powered by 3 Packard V12 engines that could push us to 40 knots when we really needed to run. But tonight, we weren't running. Tonight, we were hunting. "Sullivan, check those fish one more time," Lieutenant called back to me over the roar of the engines. The skipper was all business tonight, his weathered face set in concentration as he navigated by starlight and instinct through waters that could turn deadly in a heartbeat. I crawled forward to the torpedo tubes, my hands running over the familiar contours of the Mark I torpedoes. Each one was 21 inches in diameter, 21 feet long, and packed with 466 pounds of TNT. They weren't the most reliable fish in the Navy's arsenal, hell. The Mark I had been around since World War I, but they were what we had, and we learned to make them count. "All 4 fish ready to swim, skipper," I called back. My voice carried easily in the salt air, but I kept it low. Sound travels far over water at night, and we were deep in enemy territory. The Solomon Islands had become our backyard over the past year, but it was a backyard filled with hornets' nests. The Japanese had been running supplies down what we called the slot, the deep water channel between the island chains, almost every night since August. Their destroyers and transports would race down from their bases at Rabaul and Bougainville under cover of darkness, unload troops and supplies for their garrison on Guadalcanal, then race back north before our planes could catch them at dawn. We called it the Tokyo Express, but there was nothing express about the way those ships died when we caught them. "Contact bearing 040, whispered radioman First Class Pete Kowalski from his position at the radar scope. The crude radar set was one of the new additions to our boat, a piece of technology that gave us eyes in the darkness. Multiple targets, range 4,000 yards. Lieutenant's jaw tightened. "How many, Pete?" "I count 6. No, 7 contacts. 3 large, 4 smaller. Looks like transports with destroyer escort." I felt my heart start hammering against my ribs. 7 ships. If we played this right, it would be like shooting fish in a barrel. If we played it wrong, those destroyer guns would turn PT-109 into splinters and memories. "All right, boys," Lieutenant said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had kept us alive through a dozen night actions. "We're going to do this by the book. Danny, I want tubes 1 and 2 set for the lead transport. Pete, keep feeding me ranges and bearings. Gunner's mate Rodriguez, stand by on the 40mm. Seaman First Class Miguel Rodriguez moved to the bow gun, checking the ammunition feed on our main armament. The 40mm Bofors was our biggest punch besides the torpedoes, and Rodriguez could make that gun sing like Benny Goodman's clarinet when the shooting started. The night air was thick with humidity and tension as we closed the distance. At 3,000 yards, I could make out the dark shapes of the enemy convoy against the slightly lighter horizon. The lead ship looked like a Maru-class transport, probably carrying a full load of troops and supplies for the Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. "Range 2,500 yards, Pete whispered. "Target bearing steady 040. Lieutenant began his approach, angling PT-109 to give us a perfect 90-degree shot at the transport's beam. The key to a successful torpedo attack was getting close enough to guarantee a hit, but not so close that we couldn't escape when the fireworks started. At 1,500 yards, disaster almost struck. The lead destroyer and the escort suddenly turned toward us, its searchlight beginning a sweep pattern that would cross our bow in seconds. Hard right rudder, Lieutenant hissed, throwing the wheel over. The PT boat responded like a thoroughbred racehorse, banking into the turn so sharply that spray cascaded over the deck. We held our breath as the searchlight beams swept across the water where we'd been just moments before. But we weren't out of the woods yet. The destroyer had clearly detected something and was picking up speed, heading in our general direction. Its searchlight continued sweeping, probing the darkness for whatever had triggered its suspicion. "Skipper, we need to take the shot now or abort," I whispered urgently. Every second we delayed gave the destroyer more time to find us, and once those 5-inch guns opened up, our plywood hull wouldn't offer much protection. Lieutenant's eyes never left the target. "Range to transport? 1,200 yards in closing," Pete reported. "Perfect firing position. Stand by tubes 1 and 2, Lieutenant ordered." His hand moved to the firing controls. In the engine room below, I could hear our 3 Packards purring like sleeping tigers, ready to unleash their full power the moment we needed to run. The transport loomed larger now, a dark mountain of steel sliding through the black water. I could make out details of its superstructure, could almost imagine the Japanese soldiers sleeping in their cramped quarters below decks, unaware that death was racing toward them through the water at 46 knots. "Fire 1, Lieutenant shouted. The first torpedo leaped from its tube with a satisfying thump that I felt through the soles of my feet. 21 feet of American-made destruction disappeared into the black water, its wake barely visible as it raced toward the target. "Fire 2. The second fish followed immediately, and now we had 2 chances to send that transport to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. All ahead full. Lieutenant yanked the throttles forward, and our 3 Packard engines roared to life with a sound like controlled thunder. PT-109 leaped forward like she'd been kicked, her bow rising as we accelerated toward our maximum speed. Behind us, confusion was spreading through the Japanese convoy like wildfire. The destroyer that had been hunting us suddenly lit up like a Christmas tree as every searchlight on the ship began sweeping the water. Signal lamps flashed frantically between ships as the escort commanders tried to figure out what was happening. They had 30 seconds to figure it out before our torpedoes arrived. 45 seconds to impact, I called out, watching the luminous hands of my stopwatch. A Mark 1 torpedo at 1,200 yards needed about 90 seconds to reach its target, and we'd been running for almost a minute. The Japanese transport was still maintaining course and speed, completely unaware of the 2 fish racing toward its starboard beam. But the destroyers were another story. One of them had broken off from the convoy and was charging toward our last known position, its searchlight sweeping frantically across the water. "Contact dead ahead," Rodriguez shouted from the bow gun. "Destroyer, range 800 yards and closing fast." I looked forward and felt my blood turn to ice water. The Japanese destroyer was bearing down on us like an avenging angel, its massive bow wave throwing up sheets of phosphorescent spray. Even in the darkness, I could make out the distinctive silhouette of a Fubuki-class destroyer over 300 feet of steel armed with 6 5-inch guns and enough firepower to vaporize our little PT boat in seconds. 20 seconds to impact, I announced, still watching my stopwatch. Our torpedoes were almost home, but the destroyer would be on top of us before we could see if they hit. Lieutenant was playing the angles like a pool shark, zigzagging PT-109 through the water to spoil the destroyer's firing solution. Our wake traced a serpentine pattern behind us as we jinked left and right, our skipper using every trick he'd learned in 6 months of night fighting. 10 seconds. The searchlight beam from the destroyer swept across our stern, and for a moment we were lit up like actors on a stage. I could see Rodriguez hunched over his gun, Pete clutching the radar scope, and Lieutenant's face set in grim concentration as he fought to keep us alive for 10 more seconds. Then the night exploded. The first torpedo struck the transport amidships with a sound like the world splitting in half. A column of fire and debris erupted from the ship's side, climbing hundreds of feet into the night sky before raining back down in a shower of burning steel. The blast was so powerful it lit up the entire convoy, revealing every ship in stark, hellish detail. 3 seconds later, our second fish found its mark. This hit was even more devastating than the first. The torpedo struck near the transport's engine room, and the explosion tore the ship's back like it was made of paper. I watched in fascination and horror as the massive vessel began breaking apart, its two halves already starting to settle into the dark water. But we didn't have time to admire our handiwork. The destroyer hunting us had finally gotten a firing solution, and its first salvo screamed over our heads like a freight train. The 5-inch shells bracketed us, sending up towering waterspouts that drenched our deck with spray. "Hard left rudder," Lieutenant shouted, throwing PT-109 into another violent turn. Our port side lifted clear of the water as we banked into the turn, and I had to grab the torpedo tube to keep from being thrown overboard. The second salvo was closer, much closer. One shell exploded less than 50 yards off our starboard beam, and the concussion lifted our stern clean out of the water. I could hear shrapnel whining overhead, and the distinctive sound of wood splintering as fragments found our hull. But PT-109 was still running, her 3 Packards howling at full power as Lieutenant opened the distance between us and the destroyer. At 40 knots, we were faster than anything in the Japanese fleet except their own PT boats, and our shallow draft allowed us to operate in waters where the big ships couldn't follow. "Damage report," Lieutenant called back. I did a quick survey of our boat. Some splinter damage to the port side, but nothing critical. "We're still watertight," Rodriguez added. 40mm is operational, skipper. Ready to engage if they get close again." The Japanese convoy was in complete chaos behind us. The transport we'd hit was already disappearing beneath the waves, taking with it whatever cargo it had been carrying to reinforce the enemy garrison on Guadalcanal. The destroyers were racing around like angry hornets, their searchlights sweeping the water as they tried to find us. But we were already ghosts in the night, racing toward the safety of our base at Rendova Island at maximum speed. 20 minutes later, we were far enough away to slow down and assess what we'd accomplished. Lieutenant reduced our speed to 20 knots, just fast enough to maintain steerage way while conserving fuel for the long run home. "That was a Notomaru-class transport," Pete announced, consulting his recognition manual by the light of a red flashlight, probably carrying about 2,000 tons of supplies and maybe a battalion of infantry. I did the math in my head. A battalion of Japanese soldiers was roughly 800 men. 800 enemy troops who would never make it to the fighting on Guadalcanal. 800 fewer rifles and bayonets that our Marines and soldiers wouldn't have to face in the jungle. "Good shooting, Danny," Lieutenant said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Those fish ran straight and true." I felt a surge of pride at the compliment, but it was mixed with something else. Something darker. I'd just helped kill hundreds of men, and while I knew it was necessary and knew it would save American lives, it still felt heavy in my chest. "Skipper, I'm picking up radio chatter from the convoy," Pete reported, pressing his headphones tighter to his ears. "Sounds like they're reporting the attack to their base. They're calling us ghost boats." Lieutenant grinned grimly. "Ghost boats. I like that." The truth was, the Japanese were genuinely terrified of our PT boats. We'd learned this from interrogating prisoners and from intercepted radio messages. They called us devil boats or mosquito boats, and their fear was justified. A single PT boat could carry enough firepower to sink a transport ship, and we were small enough and fast enough to appear out of nowhere, strike, and vanish before their escorts could respond effectively. What made us even more dangerous was our shallow draft. Our boats drew only 5 feet of water when loaded, which meant we could operate in coastal waters where the big Japanese warships couldn't follow. We could hide in bays and inlets during the day, then emerge at night to hunt the Tokyo Express runs. "Contact bearing 270, Pete announced suddenly. "Single target, range 3,000 yards. Lieutenant immediately altered course to investigate. It was possible this was a straggler from the convoy we'd just hit, or perhaps another Japanese ship running alone. Either way, we still had 2 torpedoes left, and the night was young. As we closed the range, the target resolved into another transport ship, this one smaller than our first victim, but still a legitimate target. It was hugging the coastline of New Georgia Island, probably trying to avoid exactly the kind of attack we'd just delivered to its sister ship. "Range 1,500 yards, Pete whispered. "She's making about 12 knots, course 180. Lieutenant began setting up another attack approach. This time, we had the advantage of complete surprise. The transport's crew had no idea we were stalking them through the darkness, and there were no escort destroyers to complicate our attack. "Danny, set up tubes 3 and 4 for a spread shot," Lieutenant ordered. "I want to make sure we don't miss this one." I moved to the remaining torpedo tubes and began the firing sequence. The Mark I torpedoes were older technology, but they were reliable if you treated them right. Each fish was set to run at a depth of 10 feet, which would bring them in just under the target ship's waterline. "Tubes 3 and 4 ready, Skipper," I reported. At 800 yards, Lieutenant began his final approach. The transport was silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky, making it an easy target for our attack. I could make out the details of its superstructure and even see a few lights glowing in the bridge windows. "Fire 3!" The torpedo leaped from its tube and disappeared into the dark water. "Fire 4!" Our second fish followed immediately, and once again we had 2 chances to send an enemy ship to the bottom. This time, we didn't wait around to watch the show. Lieutenant immediately turned PT-109 toward open water and advanced the throttles to full power. We'd learned from experience that it was better to be running when the fireworks started rather than risk getting caught in the blast or debris field. 60 seconds later, our patience was rewarded. The first torpedo struck the transport near its bow with a tremendous explosion that lit up the entire coastline. The second hit followed within seconds, this one striking amidships and tearing a massive hole in the vessel's hull. The transport began sinking immediately, its bow already disappearing beneath the black water. We could see tiny figures jumping from the ship's deck as the crew abandoned ship, but there was little we could do for them even if we'd wanted to. This was war, and they were the enemy. 2 for 2, Rodriguez called out from the bow gun. Not bad for a night's work, but our night wasn't over yet. As we raced away from our second kill, Pete picked up more contacts on his radar scope. The entire area was crawling with Japanese ships, and we were right in the middle of them. "Multiple contacts," Pete announced, his voice tight with tension. "I count at least a dozen ships spread across our escape route. Looks like we've stirred up a hornet's nest." Lieutenant studied the tactical situation. We were about 20 miles from our base at Rendova Island, but between us and safety lay what appeared to be half the Japanese Navy. Our fuel was getting low after an hour of high-speed running, and we were completely out of torpedoes. "What do you think, Danny?" Lieutenant asked. "Try to punch through or find somewhere to hide until dawn." I considered our options. If we tried to hide, we'd be trapped if the Japanese found us during daylight. Their planes would make short work of a single PT boat caught in open water. But if we tried to run the gauntlet, we'd have to fight our way through a dozen enemy ships with nothing but our 40mm gun and a handful of machine guns. "I say we run for it, Skipper," I finally answered. "We've got the speed advantage, and most of those contacts are probably transports and cargo ships. If we can avoid their escorts, we might make it through." Lieutenant nodded grimly. "That's what I was thinking." "All right, boys, strap yourselves in. We're going home the hard way." He turned PT-109 toward the gap between 2 of the radar contacts and pushed the throttles to the stops. Our 3 Packard engines responded with a roar that could probably be heard for miles, but stealth was no longer an option. Now it was all about speed and audacity. The first 5 minutes were deceptively quiet. We raced through the darkness at 40 knots. Threading between invisible enemy ships like a needle through cloth. Pete called out ranges and bearings from his radar scope, guiding Lieutenant around the worst concentrations of contacts. Then somebody spotted us. A searchlight beam swept across our bow, held for a moment, then snapped back to lock onto our boat. Suddenly, we were racing through a tunnel of brilliant white light, exposed and vulnerable as the Japanese ships tried to figure out what we were. "Contact port beam," Rodriguez shouted. "Destroyer range 600 yards." I looked to port and saw the lean silhouette of a Japanese destroyer racing to intercept us. Its guns were already training in our direction, and I could see muzzle flashes beginning to blink along its side as the ship opened fire. The first salvo missed by 100 yards, sending up towering waterspouts that drenched our deck with spray. The second salvo was closer, and the third was close enough to make us all duck instinctively as the shells screamed overhead. But Lieutenant was weaving PT-109 through the water like a slalom racer, never maintaining the same course for more than a few seconds. The constant changes in direction made it almost impossible for the destroyer's gunners to get a clean shot at us. "Another contact starboard bow," Pete called out. "This one's turning to ram." I looked ahead and saw a second destroyer charging toward us head-on, its massive bow wave throwing up sheets of phosphorescent spray. The Japanese captain was trying to use his ship's size and armored hull to simply run us down, trusting his steel construction to survive any collision with our plywood boat. "Hard right rudder," Lieutenant shouted, throwing the wheel over so violently that our port side lifted completely out of the water. PT-109 banked into the turn like a fighter plane, her hull groaning under the stress, but holding together. The destroyer flashed past us so close I could have thrown a baseball onto its deck. I could see Japanese sailors running along its rails, could make out individual faces in the glare of their searchlights. For just a moment, we were close enough to see each other as human beings rather than faceless enemies. Then we were past, racing away into the darkness, while the destroyer tried to reverse its course and pursue us. But our troubles were just beginning. The entire Japanese convoy was now aware of our presence, and every ship was converging on our position. Searchlights swept the water from a dozen different directions, and muzzle flashes lit up the night as ship after ship opened fire on us. "This is like flying through a fireworks display," Rodriguez muttered, ducking as another salvo of shells screamed overhead. For 20 minutes, we played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant used every trick in the book: sudden course changes, radical speed variations, even cutting our engines completely for a few seconds to confuse their fire control to keep us alive as we fought our way through the gauntlet. Twice more, destroyers tried to ram us. Each time, Lieutenant's skill and PT-109's agility saved our lives by margins measured in yards. Our hull was perforated by shrapnel in a dozen places, our radio antenna was shot away, and Rodriguez's 40mm gun mount was damaged by a near miss. But we were still afloat and still running. Finally, mercifully, we broke free of the enemy formation and found ourselves in open water with nothing but darkness ahead. Behind us, the Japanese ships were still firing, but we were beyond effective range now and pulling away fast. "Rendova Island dead ahead," Pete announced, relief obvious in his voice. "Range 12 miles. We'd made it. Somehow, against all odds, we'd fought our way through an entire enemy fleet and lived to tell about it. By the time we limped into Rendova Harbor, the eastern sky was beginning to show the first gray hints of dawn. PT-109's engines were coughing and missing from the strain of running at full power for so long, and our fuel tanks were nearly empty. But we were home, and we were alive. Commander William Wild Bill Libano, the squadron commander, was waiting for us at the dock with a bottle of bourbon and a handful of intelligence officers. As we tied up alongside the pier, I could see other PT boat crews gathering to hear our report. "Well?" Libano asked as Lieutenant stepped onto the dock. "How did it go out there?" Lieutenant's exhausted face broke into a grin. "2 transports confirmed sunk, sir. And we gave their escort something to think about on the way home." The intelligence officers immediately swarmed us with questions. How many ships had we seen? What types? What were their courses and speeds? Were there any new radar installations on the Japanese-held islands? The debriefing would go on for hours, but first we needed food, coffee, and a chance to patch up our boat. As I supervised the damage assessment on PT-109, I couldn't help but think about what we'd accomplished. 2 enemy transport ships sent to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. Probably 3,000 tons of supplies and equipment destroyed. Maybe 1,000 enemy soldiers who would never make it to the fighting on Guadalcanal. But the cost had been high too. Our boat was shot full of holes and would need days of repair work before she was ready for another patrol. And we'd used up 4 precious torpedoes and weapons that were in critically short supply throughout the Pacific. Still, it had been worth it. Every enemy ship we sank was one less threat to our Marines fighting in the jungle. Every transport that went to the bottom was a victory for American arms and a step closer to ultimate victory in the Pacific. "Hey, Danny," Lieutenant called out as he finished his initial report to the intelligence officers. Good work out there tonight. Those torpedo shots were perfect. I felt a surge of pride at the compliment. In 6 months of night fighting, I'd learned that praise from Lieutenant was not given lightly. The man was a perfectionist who demanded nothing less than absolute competence from his crew, and earning his respect meant something. Just doing my job, Skipper, I replied. But inside, I was glowing with satisfaction. As the sun climbed higher, other PT boats began returning from their patrols. Some came back empty-handed, their crews frustrated by mechanical problems or missed opportunities. Others brought tales of successful attacks on enemy barges and supply ships. But none had matched our score of 2 transports sunk in a single night. The news of our success spread quickly through the base, and by mid-morning we were minor celebrities. Other crews wanted to hear every detail of our attack, and the intelligence officers were already planning future operations based on what we'd learned about Japanese convoy routes and tactics. For me, though, the most satisfying moment came when I overheard 2 Marines talking at the mess hall. Did you hear about PT-109? One of them was saying, they nailed 2 transports last night. That's probably a whole regiment of infantry that won't be shooting at us next week. The other Marine nodded grimly. Those PT boat guys are all right by me. Every ship they sink means fewer of us get killed. That's what it was all about, I realized. Not the glory or the excitement or the adrenaline rush of combat. It was about protecting the guys on the ground, the Marines and soldiers who had to take these islands one bloody yard at a time. Every enemy ship we sent to the bottom meant fewer American boys would die in the jungle. 3 days later, PT-109 was seaworthy again, her hull patched and her engines tuned. Lieutenant had managed to scrounge 4 more Mark 1 torpedoes from the squadron's dwindling supply, and we were ready for another patrol. But first, we received some sobering news. Intelligence reports confirmed that our first target had indeed been a Notomaru-class transport carrying reinforcements for the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal. The ship had gone down with all hands over 800 Japanese soldiers and crew. Our second target had been a smaller cargo vessel carrying ammunition and medical supplies. Another 200 men had died when that ship sank. 1,000 enemy dead in a single night's work. I should have felt proud or at least satisfied. These were the enemy after all. They were the ones who had attacked Pearl Harbor, who were torturing American prisoners, who were fighting to extend their empire across the Pacific. Every one of them we killed brought final victory one step closer. But I kept thinking about those tiny figures I'd seen jumping from the sinking transport. They'd been human beings after all. Somebody's sons and brothers and fathers, just like us. The fact that they were fighting for the wrong side didn't make them any less human. You're thinking too much, Lieutenant said, finding me staring out at the harbor during the evening before our next patrol. I can see it in your face. I turned to look at my skipper. How do you do it, sir? How do you sleep at night knowing how many men we've killed? Lieutenant was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the distant horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and thoughtful. I think about the alternatives, Danny. I think about what would happen if we didn't sink those ships. Those 800 Japanese soldiers would have made it to Guadalcanal, where they would have killed God knows how many Marines and soldiers. Those supplies would have kept their garrison fighting for weeks longer, costing more American lives. He turned to look at me directly. War is about making terrible choices, Sullivan. We can either kill them or let them kill us. There's no middle ground, no compromise, no negotiation. The only way this war ends is when one side or the other can't fight anymore. I nodded slowly, understanding his logic even if I didn't entirely like it. Besides, Lieutenant continued, the Japanese aren't exactly showing mercy to our boys they capture. You've seen the intelligence reports about their prisoner of war camps. You've heard what they did at Bataan. This isn't a gentleman's war fought with rules and referees. It's a fight for survival, and the winner takes everything. That night, as we prepared for another patrol, I tried to focus on Lieutenant's words. Every enemy ship we sank meant fewer Americans would die. Every transport that went to the bottom was a victory for freedom and democracy over fascism and militarism. but I still couldn't forget those tiny figures jumping from the burning ship. Our second patrol took us back to the same hunting grounds where we'd scored our double kill 3 nights earlier. Intelligence reports suggested that the Japanese were still running supply convoys through the slot, despite our success and the efforts of other PT boat squadrons. The enemy was getting smarter, though. Instead of running large convoys with heavy escorts, they were switching to smaller groups of fast ships that could make the round trip to Guadalcanal in a single night. These rat runs were harder to intercept, but they also carried smaller loads of supplies and reinforcements. We found our first target just after midnight, a single destroyer running alone at high speed toward Guadalcanal. It was probably carrying ammunition or medical supplies in its storage compartments, making it a legitimate target despite its armament. But attacking a destroyer was a different proposition from attacking a transport. Destroyers were fast, heavily armed, and designed specifically for night fighting. Their crews were trained for exactly this kind of encounter, and they wouldn't be caught off guard the way a merchant ship's crew might be. Range 2,000 yards. Pete whispered from his radar scope. Target bearing 090, speed 28 knots. Lieutenant began his approach carefully, using islands and reefs to mask our advance. At 1,500 yards, he turned PT-109 parallel to the destroyer's course and began setting up for a classic beam shot. Tubes 1 and 2 readies, I reported softly. Fire 1. Our first torpedo leaped from its tube and disappeared into the black water. At this range, it would take 70 seconds to reach the target, plenty of time for things to go wrong. Fire 2. The second fish followed immediately. But this time, the Japanese were ready for us. Almost as soon as our torpedoes were in the water, the destroyer's searchlights began sweeping the area. Within seconds, one of the beams locked onto our boat and every gun on the ship began training in our direction. Hard left rudder, Lieutenant shouted, throwing PT-109 into a violent turn just as the destroyer's main armament opened fire. The first salvo missed by 50 yards, sending up towering waterspouts that drenched our deck. The second salvo was closer, and fragments from the exploding shells whined overhead like angry wasps. 60 seconds to impact, I called out, watching my stopwatch as we raced away from the destroyer at full speed. Behind us, the Japanese ship had altered course and was charging toward our torpedo tracks, trying to avoid the fish we'd launched. Its captain was good. I could see the destroyer's wake beginning to curve as it turned to present its stern to our torpedoes. He's going to dodge them, Pete called out grimly. But our skipper had anticipated this. Lieutenant had fired both torpedoes in a spread pattern, calculating where the destroyer would be when it tried to evade our attack. As the Japanese ship turned to avoid the first torpedo, it ran directly into the path of the second. The explosion was tremendous. Our fish struck the destroyer amidships, right in the engine room, and the entire ship seemed to lift out of the water for a moment before crashing back down in a shower of debris and burning fuel. The destroyer's back was broken. Within minutes, it was settling by the stern, its bow rising higher and higher as water flooded the aft compartments. We could see tiny figures abandoning ship, jumping into the black water as their vessel died beneath them. That's one less rat in the pipeline, Rodriguez said grimly from his position at the 40mm gun. But our celebration was premature. Even as we watched the destroyer sink, Pete picked up new contacts on his radar scope. Multiple targets bearing 270, he announced. Range 4,000 yards and closing fast. I looked toward the indicated bearing and felt my heart sink. Racing toward us across the dark water were the sleek silhouettes of 4 Japanese destroyers, their guns already training in our direction as they closed the range. We'd stumbled into a trap. The lone destroyer we'd just sunk had been bait, and we'd taken it like hungry fish going after a worm. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. 4 Japanese destroyers against 1 American PT boat, odds that no amount of skill or luck could overcome in a straight fight. Our only hope was to use our speed and shallow draft to escape into waters where the big ships couldn't follow. Lieutenant immediately turned PT-109 toward the nearest island, pushing our engines to their absolute maximum as we raced for the safety of shallow water. Behind us, the Japanese destroyers were spreading out in a line abreast formation, trying to cut off all possible escape routes. Range to the nearest ship, Lieutenant called back to Pete. 3,000 yards and closing fast, came the reply. They're making at least 30 knots. We were faster than they were, but not by much. And they had us outnumbered 4-1, with enough firepower to vaporize our little boat in seconds if they got a clean shot. The first salvo came at 2,500 yards, a full broadside from the lead destroyer that straddled our wake and sent up towering columns of water. The concussion from the near misses lifted our stern clear of the water and rattled every rivet in our hull. Rodriguez muttered, hunching over his gun, "They're really trying to kill us." Lieutenant was weaving PT-109 through the water like a broken field runner, never holding the same course for more than a few seconds. Every time the Japanese gunners thought they had a firing solution, our skipper would throw the wheel over and change direction, spoiling their aim and buying us a few more precious seconds of life. But we were running out of sea room. The island we were heading for was still 2 miles away, and the destroyers were closing the range steadily. At 2,000 yards, their fire became devastatingly accurate, and it was only Lieutenant's skill and our boat's agility that kept us alive. One shell exploded less than 20 yards off our port beam, and the blast waved through me against the torpedo tubes hard enough to knock the wind out of my lungs. When I struggled back to my feet, I could taste blood in my mouth and feel warm liquid running down my forehead. "Danny, you all right?" Lieutenant called back. "Still breathing, skipper," I managed to gasp. The next salvo was even closer. 3 shells exploded simultaneously, bracketing us so tightly that our boat was lifted completely out of the water by the combined blast waves. For a terrifying moment, PT-109 hung in midair like a toy, then crashed back down with a bone-jarring impact that threw all of us to the deck. When I picked myself up, I could see daylight through a dozen new holes in our hull. Our port engine was coughing and smoking, and Pete's radar scope had gone dark. "We're taking on water," Rodriguez reported from the bow. "Not critical yet, but it's getting worse." Lieutenant's face was grim in the reflected light of the enemy searchlights. We were still a mile from the island, and the destroyers were close enough now that I could make out individual gun mounts and crew members on their decks. Then salvation came from an unexpected quarter. "Skipper, look astern," Pete shouted, pointing behind us. Racing out of the darkness came 3 more PT boats, our squadron mates responding to our radio calls for help. Even with our antenna shot away, Pete had managed to jury-rig a distress signal using the emergency transmitter. PT-103, PT-105, and PT-108 came roaring out of the night like avenging angels, their engines howling at full power as they closed the range to the Japanese destroyers. Each boat carried 4 Mark I torpedoes, giving our reinforcements enough firepower to even the odds. The lead boat, PT-103, immediately launched a spread of torpedoes at the nearest destroyer. The Japanese ship tried to evade, but at close range there was nowhere to run. 2 fish struck home, and the destroyer exploded in a pillar of fire that lit up half the ocean. The remaining 3 destroyers suddenly found themselves facing 4 American PT boats instead of hunting 1 wounded duck. Their formation began to break up as each ship tried to engage multiple targets simultaneously. PT-105 scored next, putting a torpedo into the second destroyer's bow that brought the ship to a dead stop. PT-108 raked a third destroyer with 40 mm fire, setting fires along its superstructure and knocking out several gun mounts. The Japanese, faced with rapidly deteriorating odds, decided discretion was the better part of valor. The surviving destroyers turned north and ran for home at maximum speed, leaving their burning sisters behind. "Thank God for the cavalry," Lieutenant muttered as we limped toward the island with our squadron mates escorting us. We barely made it to the beach. PT-109's hull was so perforated that she was taking on water faster than our pumps could handle it. Lieutenant beached her in a small cove on the island's south side, running the bow up onto the sand just as our engines finally gave up the ghost. The other PT boats stood offshore, their crews ready to take us off if our boat sank completely. But PT-109 had carried us this far, and she wasn't going to quit now. Settled firmly on the sand with her stern in 3 feet of water, she'd live to fight another day. "Damage report," Lieutenant ordered as we waded ashore. I did a quick survey of our battered boat. 17 holes in the hull, port engine destroyed, starboard engine damaged but repairable. We lost the radio antenna, radar scope, and about half our electrical system. Rodriguez added his assessment. 40mm gun is still operational, but we're down to about 50 rounds of ammunition. And we've got no torpedoes left. Lieutenant nodded grimly. Could have been worse. We could all be dead. While we worked to patch the worst of the holes in PT-109's hull, the other boats' crews filled us in on what had happened. The Japanese had indeed set a trap, using the lone destroyer's bait to lure PT boats into range of a larger force. We'd been the unlucky ones who took the bait. But our sacrifice hadn't been in vain. The destroyer we'd sunk had been carrying critical communications equipment and codebooks for the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal. Intelligence estimated that its loss would disrupt enemy operations for weeks. "You boys did good tonight," Lieutenant Commander Jack Kennedy called out from PT-109's bridge as his boat, PT-109, stood by to assist. "That destroyer you nailed was worth 3 transports." By dawn, we had PT-109 patched well enough to make the journey back to base. Our port engine was still dead, but the starboard engine was running smoothly again, and Rodriguez had jury-rigged a temporary radio antenna using spare wire and a fishing pole. The trip back to Rendova took 4 hours instead of the usual 2, but we made it. Commander Libano was waiting at the dock with a medical corpsman and a bottle of bourbon. "Lieutenant," he said as he surveyed our shot-up boat, "what the hell did you tangle with out there?" "4 destroyers and a bad attitude," Lieutenant replied with a tired grin. "But we gave as good as we got." The intelligence officers were particularly interested in our encounter. The fact that the Japanese were using bait tactics showed they were adapting to our methods, becoming more sophisticated in their anti-PT boat operations. It was information that would be passed along to all the squadron commanders in the Solomons. But more importantly, we'd proven that American PT boats could take on Japanese destroyers and win. It wasn't easy, it wasn't safe, and it required a lot of luck along with skill and courage. But it could be done. 2 weeks later, PT-109 was fully repaired and back on patrol. We'd gotten a new port engine, a better radar set, and 4 more Mark I torpedoes. More importantly, we'd gotten a new crew member, gunner's mate 2nd Class Tommy O'Brien, a veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign who'd volunteered for PT boat duty. O'Brien fit in well with our tight-knit crew. He was quiet, competent, and steady under fire, exactly the kind of man you wanted watching your back in a fight. His first patrol with us resulted in another successful attack on a Japanese transport, this one carrying aviation fuel to their airfield on Bougainville. As the months passed, our successes mounted. PT-109 and her crew became known throughout the squadron for our ability to find and sink enemy ships. We developed new tactics for night attacks, improved our torpedo firing techniques, and learned to work together like a well-oiled machine. But the war was changing around us. The big naval battles Midway, the Philippine Sea, Lake Gulf were decided by aircraft carriers and battleships, not PT boats. Our role was becoming more specialized, more focused on interdiction and reconnaissance rather than major fleet actions. Still, we were making a difference. Every enemy ship we sank meant fewer supplies reaching Japanese garrisons. Every transport that went to the bottom meant fewer reinforcements for the enemy's shrinking perimeter. We were tightening the noose around Japan's Pacific Empire, 1 torpedo at a time. The psychological effect of our operations was just as important as the physical damage we inflicted. The Japanese had dubbed us devil boats, and their fear of night attacks by PT boats was disrupting their entire supply system. Convoys that once ran boldly down the slot now hugged coastlines and traveled in heavily escorted groups, reducing their efficiency and increasing their vulnerability to air attack. By the time the war ended in August 1945, PT-109 and her crew had sunk 14 enemy vessels, 7 transports, 4 destroyers, 2 cruisers, and a submarine. We'd survived 63 combat patrols, been shot up more times than I could count, and somehow managed to bring all our crew members home alive. I'm writing this account 50 years after the events I've described, sitting in my study in Portland, Oregon, with my grandchildren playing in the yard outside. The Pacific War has been over for half a century, but the memories are as clear as if they happened yesterday. We won that war, of course. American industry, American technology, and American courage proved superior to Japanese fanaticism and aggression. But the cost was enormous: over 400,000 American military personnel killed, and millions more wounded or scarred by their experiences. The Japanese losses were even more staggering. An estimated 2.7 million Japanese military personnel died during the war, along with hundreds of thousands of civilians. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought the conflict to an end, but they also ushered in an age where humanity possessed the power to destroy itself completely. Sometimes I wonder about those men I saw jumping from the burning transport ships. Did any of them survive? Did they have families waiting for them back in Japan? What did they think about during their last moments in the water? I'll never know the answers to those questions, and perhaps it's better that way. War strips away all the comfortable illusions about the value of individual human life and reduces everything to simple mathematics. Kill them before they kill you. Sink their ships before they sink yours. Win at any cost, because losing means extinction. PT-109 herself didn't survive the war. She was scrapped in 1945 along with hundreds of other PT boats that were no longer needed. But her legacy lived on in the men who served aboard her and the tactics we developed during our months of night fighting in the Solomons. Lieutenant went on to command a destroyer squadron in the later stages of the war and retired as a rear admiral. Pete Kowalski became a radar technician and helped develop the early warning systems that protected America during the Cold War. Rodriguez opened a garage in San Antonio and raised 5 children. O'Brien became a police officer and served his community for 30 years. As for me, I used my GI Bill benefits to study engineering and spent 40 years designing ships for the Navy. Every vessel I worked on incorporated lessons learned during those terrifying nights in the Solomon Islands when a few young men in plywood boats took on the Imperial Japanese Navy and somehow lived to tell about it. The Mark 1 torpedoes we used were obsolete even when we were firing them, but they got the job done. Like everything else about our war in the Pacific, we made do with what we had and found a way to win. American ingenuity, determination, and courage proved superior to better equipment and more experienced enemies. But perhaps the most important lesson I learned during my time aboard PT-109 was the value of the men who served beside me. Lieutenant's leadership, Pete's technical expertise, Rodriguez's steady courage, and O'Brien's quiet competence, these were the real weapons that won the war. Ships and planes and torpedoes were just tools. The real strength of America lay in the character of the men who wielded those tools. The Japanese feared our PT boats, called us devil boats and ghost boats, but we weren't devils or ghosts. We were just young Americans doing our job, fighting for our country and our way of life against an enemy that had attacked us without warning or provocation. We were night hunters, prowling the dark waters of the Pacific in search of prey. We were David taking on Goliath, armed with nothing but courage, skill, and an unshakable belief that our cause was just. And in the end, that was enough. The war ended on September 2, 1945, when Japanese officials signed the surrender documents aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. For those of us who had fought in the Pacific, it seemed almost anticlimactic after years of brutal combat. The killing simply stopped, and we were free to go home and try to build normal lives. But the memories never fade. Even now, 50 years later, I can still hear the roar of PT-109's engines at full power, can still feel the deck bucking beneath my feet as we race through the night toward another engagement with the enemy. I can still see the flash of torpedo explosions lighting up the darkness, still remember the satisfaction of watching another enemy ship disappear beneath the black waters of Iron Bottom Sound. We were the night hunters, and those were our hunting grounds. For 2 years, the Solomon Islands belonged to us after dark, and the Japanese Navy learned to fear the sound of PT boat engines echoing across the water. It was a different war then, fought by different rules with different weapons. But the courage, determination, and sacrifice of the men who fought it remained the same. They were the greatest generation America ever produced, and I was honored to serve among them aboard a small, fast boat in the dark waters of the Pacific. The war may be over, but the lessons it taught us about courage, about duty, about the price of freedom remain as relevant today as they were in 1942. Every generation faces its own challenges, its own enemies, its own moment when ordinary people must do extraordinary things to preserve what they hold dear. For my generation, that moment came in the form of a world war that threatened to extinguish freedom and democracy everywhere. We answered the call, did our duty, and came home to build the America we wanted our children to inherit. Now it's up to them and their children to meet whatever challenges the future may bring. I hope they do it with the same courage, determination, and sacrifice that characterized the men who sailed PT boats through the Sullivan Islands during those long, dark nights of World War II. We were night hunters then, and the hunt never really ends.